All right, let's read another edition of the Rambler by Dr. Samuel Johnson. This is Rambler number 34 for Saturday, July 14th, 1750. The title of which is The Uneasiness and Disgust of Female Cowardice. Interesting. There's a little Latin here. Non sin vano aurarum et silus metu by Horace. I don't know what it means though. And then here's a quote. Alarmed with every rising gale, in every wood, in every vale. Elphinston. I have been censured for having hitherto dedicated so few of my speculations to the ladies. And indeed, the moralist, whose instructions are accommodated only to 1/2 of the human species, must be confessed not sufficiently to have extended his views. Yet it is to be considered that masculine duties afford more room for counsels and observations, as they are less uniform and connected with things more subject to vicissitude and accident. We therefore find that in philosophical discourses which treat by precept or historical narrative, that instruct by example, the peculiar virtues or faults of women fill but a small part, perhaps generally too small, for so much of our domestic happiness is in their hands, and their influence is so great upon our earliest years, that the universal interest of the world requires them to be well instructed in their province. Nor can it be thought proper that the qualities by which so much pain or pleasure may be given should be left to the direction of chance. I have therefore willingly given a place in my paper to a letter which perhaps may not be wholly useless to them whose chief ambition is to please, as it shows how certainly the end is missed by absurd and injudicious endeavors at distinction. Here's the letter. To the Rambler. Sir, I am a young gentlewoman at my own disposal, with a considerable estate, and having passed through the common forms of education, spent some time in foreign countries, and made myself distinguished since my return in the politest company. I am now arrived at that part of life in which every man is expected to settle and provide for the continuation of his lineage. I withstood for some time the solicitations and remonstrances of my aunts and uncles, but at last was persuaded to visit Anthea, an heiress whose land lies contiguous to mine, and whose birth and beauty are without objection. Our friends declared that we were born for each other. All those on both sides who had no interest in hindering our union contributed to promote it, and were conspiring to hurry us into matrimony before we had any opportunity of knowing one another. I was, however, too old to be given away without my own consent, and having happened to pick up an opinion which to many of my relations seemed extremely odd, that a man might be unhappy with a large estate, determined to obtain a nearer knowledge of the person with whom I was to pass the remainder of my time. To protract the courtship was by no means difficult, for Anthea had a wonderful faculty of evading questions which I seldom repeated, and of barring approaches which I had no great eagerness to press. Thus the time passed away in visits and civilities without any ardent professions of love or formal offers of settlements. I often attended her to public places, in which, as is well known, all behavior is so much regulated by custom that very little insight can be gained into the private character, and therefore I was not yet able to inform myself of her humor and inclinations. At last I ventured to propose to her to make one of a small party, and spend a day in viewing a seat and gardens a few miles distant, and having upon her compliance collected the rest of the company, I brought at an hour a coach which I had borrowed from an acquaintance, having delayed to buy one myself till I should have an opportunity of taking the lady's opinion for whose use it was intended. Anthea came down, but as she was going to step into the coach, started back with great appearance of terror, and told us that she durst not enter for the shocking color of the lining, which had so much the air of the mourning coach in which she followed her aunt's funeral 3 years before, that she should never have her poor dear aunt out of her head. I knew that it was not for lovers to argue with their mistresses. I therefore sent back the coach and got another more gay. Into this we all entered. The coachman began to drive, and we were amusing ourselves with the expectation of what we should see, when, upon a small inclination of the carriage, Anthea screamed out that we were overthrown. We were obliged to fix all our attention upon her, which she took care to keep by renewing her outcries at every corner where we had occasion to turn. At intervals, she entertained us with fretful complaints of the uneasiness of the coach, and obliged me to call several times to the coachman to take care and drive without jolting. The poor fellow endeavored to please us, and therefore moved very slowly, till Anthea found out that this pace would only keep us longer on the stones, and desired that I would order him to make more speed. He whipped his horses. The coach jolted again, and Anthea very complacently told us how much she repented that she made one of our company. At last we got into the smooth road, and began to think our difficulties at an end, when, on a sudden, Anthea saw a brook before us, which she could not venture to pass. We were, therefore, obliged to alight, that we might walk over the bridge. But when we came to it, we found it so narrow that Anthea durst not set her foot upon it, and was content, after long consultation, to call the coach back, and with innumerable precautions, terrors, and lamentations, crossed the brook. It was necessary, after this delay, to mend our pace, and directions were accordingly given to the coachman, when Anthea informed us that it was common for the axle to catch fire with a quick motion, and begged for me to look out every minute lest we should all be consumed. I was forced to obey, and give her from time to time the most solemn declarations that all was safe, and that I hoped we should reach the place without losing our lives either by fire or water. Thus we passed on, over ways soft and hard, with more or less speed, but always with new vicissitudes of anxiety. If the ground was hard, we were jolted. If soft, we were sinking. If we went fast, we should be overturned. If slowly, we should never reach the place. At length she saw something which she called a cloud, and began to consider that at that time of the year it frequently thundered. This seemed to be the capital terror, for after that the coach was suffered to move on, and no danger was thought too dreadful to be encountered, provided she could get into a house before the thunder. Thus our whole conversation passed in dangers, and cares, and fears, and consolations, and stories of ladies dragged in the mire, forced to spend all the night on a heath, drowned in rivers, and burnt with lightning. And no sooner had a hair's breadth escape set us free from one calamity, but we were threatened with another. At length we reached the house where we intended to regale ourselves, and I proposed to Anthea the choice of a great number of dishes, which the place, being well provided for entertainment, happened to afford. She made some objection to everything that was offered. One thing she hated at that time of the year, another she could not bear, since she had seen it spoiled at Lady Feedwell's table. Another she was sure they could not dress at this house, and another she could not touch without French sauce. At last she fixed her mind upon salmon, but there was no salmon in the house. It was, however, procured with great expedition, and when it came to the table, she found that her fright had taken away her stomach, which indeed she thought no great loss, for she could never believe that anything at the inn could be cleanly got. Dinner was now over, and the company proposed, for I was now past the condition of making overtures, that we should pursue our original design of visiting the gardens. Anthea declared that she could not imagine what pleasure we expected from the sight of a few green trees and a little gravel and 2 or 3 pits of clear water. That for her part she hated walking till the cool of the evening, and the thought of it very likely to rain, and again wished that she had stayed at home. We then reconciled ourselves to our disappointment and began to talk of common subjects, when Anthea told us that since we came to see gardens, she would not hinder our satisfaction. We all rose and walked through the enclosures, for some time with no other trouble than the necessity of watching lest a frog should hop across the way, which Anthea told us would certainly kill her, if she should happen to see him. Frogs, as it fell out, there were none, but when we were within a furlong of the gardens, Anthea saw some sheep, and heard the weather clink his bell, which she was sure was not hung upon him for nothing, and therefore no assurances nor entreaties should prevail upon her to go a step further. She was sorry to disappoint the company, but her life was dearer to her than ceremony. We came back to the inn, and Anthea now discovered that there was no time to be lost in returning, for the night would come upon us, and 1,000 misfortunes might happen in the dark. The horses were immediately harnessed, and Anthea, having wondered what could seduce her to stay so long, was eager to set out. But we had now a new scene of terror. Every man we saw was a robber, and we were ordered sometimes to drive hard, lest the traveler whom we saw behind should overtake us, and sometimes to stop, lest we should all come up to him who was passing before us. She alarmed many an honest man by begging him to spare her life as he passed by the coach, and drew me into 15 quarrels with persons who increased her fright, by kindly stopping to inquire whether they could assist us. At last we came home, and she told her company next day what a pleasant ride she had been taking. I suppose, sir, I need not inquire of you what deductions may be made from this narrative, nor what happiness can arise from the society of that woman who mistakes cowardice for elegance, and imagines all delicacy to consist in refusing to be pleased. I am, etc. And no signature. What an interesting cautionary tale. Take care.